You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 24th of June 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Russia threatens unspecified retribution for Ukrainian strikes with American missiles. Israel braces for a war on two fronts, and South Korean electricity supplies murdered by crows. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Olga Tokaryuk and James Rogers will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll meet the Dutch enthusiast preserving an old-school way of gaming for future generations of pinball wizards. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Olga Tokaryuk, Ukrainian journalist and fellow at Chatham House Leadership Academy, and by James Rogers, Associate Professor of International Journalism at City University of London. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hi, Andrew.
Olga, we will start with you. Just for a change, you have not come here today to alert us to the presence of South American wildlife in West London. For listeners bewildered by that introduction, we discovered, thanks to Olga, a few appearances back, that there is a capybara in Hanwell. I'm just pointing that out because I
hope it's still there.
Yeah, I just like saying the sentence. There is a capybara in Hanwell. A satisfying word, capybara. But you have been to Amsterdam, so the obvious question is, did you see, while in Amsterdam, any capybaras?
No.
That's a shame.
I'm not sure it's part of Amsterdam's wildlife.
I didn't think it was part of Hanwell's.
Well, London doesn't stop surprising you. Maybe if I stayed longer in Amsterdam, I would have seen some.
What were you actually up to?
It was a very short trip, just 24 hours. I spoke there at Mozilla Fest about the future of AI and AI accountability in war, talking about Ukraine's experience of using AI. It was a bit weird because I felt like I was devil's advocate in a way, because everybody was so critical, and like spoke about the doom and gloom that AI is going to bring to humanity. And I was saying, well, Ukrainians are actually using it for efficiently, defending themselves against Russian invasion. So
we're not, in your view, going to be actually enslaved by our new AI overlords?
We might, but not just yet.
OK, well, that's something. James, you have recently been to Copenhagen, but interestingly, you went by train.
I did, and I didn't get quite as far as Copenhagen, Andrew, though. The train I was travelling on, the last train I was travelling on, I couldn't travel on a single train from London all the way to Denmark, but that was going eventually to Copenhagen and then to Malmö in Sweden. So the last leg of my journey was from Hamburg.
I sit corrected. How long does it take to get from London to Denmark on a train?
I came the way back in one single day, and it took about 17 hours. So I left early in the morning and got back late in the evening. On the way there, I spent the evening in Hamburg. On the way, broke my journey there.
Did you enjoy going to Denmark in that fashion?
I did. I'm very keen on travelling by train, and less so on travelling short haul by plane in Europe. Because I've experienced so many delays recently. But I just find it a better way to work and to read and to get a sense of the country. I've been learning German half-heartedly for the last couple of years, so it's nice to pass through Germany and get a chance to practice a bit of it. Obviously, if I were in a rush, it's not the most practical way, but, I did enjoy it. And I, as I say, I got quite a lot of work done on the journey that I wouldn't have done, going through airport security, battling to get my luggage into the overhead locker, etc., etc.
Yeah, well, I can confirm from relatively recent experience that travelling by air from Zurich to London can take, how long did it end up taking me? I don't know, about 14 hours. And that might be doable in about the same time by rail.
It might be, yeah.
I do recommend people looking into it. All rail travel in recent years. But it's also where Russia is continuing its education in the difficulties of holding territory belonging to an adversary equipped with long-range missiles. Yesterday, Ukraine used US-supplied ATACMS missiles to hit a target in occupied Crimea. Reports suggest it was a satellite radar facility. Local officials claim that 4 people were killed, including 2 children, and more than 150 injured by missile debris descending on a nearby beach. Russia claimed US involvement in directing the missiles and threatened, as it often does, consequences. James, first of all, also worth noting that Ukrainian sources are claiming that the missile debris which landed on the beach was from a Russian missile which exploded somewhere where it shouldn't have. Obviously, I don't think anyone in this studio can know for sure. But to talk first of all about Russia's threats of retribution, which is something we have heard quite a lot of over the last 2.5 years, should we be taking them any more seriously than we ever have?
Yes, I think so, although the form which they may take may not be absolutely clear. I mean, I was just thinking of an incident I was discussing earlier today for some research that I'm doing, in which, we're talking about incidents in Russia in the early 2000s, when this country infuriated Russia by offering asylum to Boris Berezovsky, who'd been a leading politician and businessman in Russia, a very controversial figure. And the person to whom I was speaking, who'd been a senior foreign office figure, was saying that, and then the Russians threatened us with repercussions. The repercussions, it turned out, were the closure of the British Council offices, and they're being raided for tax purposes. So it wasn't something that was immediate and expected, but it was related to it, and it took a different form. If from this retaliatory measures we're supposed to assume that there'll be some kind of military strike, I don't think it'll be anything as obvious as that on a Western target, at least not at this stage.
I mean, Olga, how does this conversation sound to Ukrainians, the idea of Ukraine's allies sort of worrying out loud about what Russia's retribution might be? Does this all seem fairly idle when you come from a country which has been, well, not under direct military threat, but under actual direct military attack from Russia for 2.5 years?
Yeah, well, it's been under Russian attack for 10 years, to be fair.
Indeed so.
Russia often uses threats and blackmail as a way of achieving its goals, or at least keeping the West from supporting Ukraine more, from delivering more weapons, from allowing Ukraine to strike targets on Russian territory. And it's been quite efficient in the first phase of the full-scale invasion. But I think the West, with time, is becoming more and more immune to these threats, and because very often they are not followed by any deeds. Russia has been using nuclear blackmail on many occasions. And all the fear of escalation that there is, especially in the US, I think they are just playing with that because they know that the current administration, they continue this policy of escalation management. Somehow they are really, they don't want to the war to involve more countries and to, just widen and transform into a global conflict. And I think Russians are just playing with this unwillingness, with this fear. That's why they are continuing with these threats. But I don't think something really significant is going to follow.
James, the Ukrainians had been asking for these long-range missiles for a long time, as they have asked repeatedly for further deliveries of more and more sophisticated weapons. Does it strike you from what we're seeing from the ATACMS and what they've now been able to do with drones more recently that the game is changing? You reported from Russia for a long time. It's a country you know well. If there are more strikes, not just on occupied territory, though Russia does believe Crimea is effectively part of Russia, but also over the weekend, Ukraine bombed a drone warehouse in Krasnodar. Yeah. There's been various other reports of strikes on actual Russian territory. Vast though Russia is, and sporadically reported though I'm sure a lot of this is, does this start to get to a point where a critical mass of the Russian public start asking, what are we actually doing?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about this, actually, I think, because that could actually go two ways. Because at one point, yes, of course, you're right, some people in the Russian public will start saying, well, what are we doing here? And yet others, if the Kremlin spins this in the way that they want to, will say, well, wait a minute, we've always been told actually it's the West that's against us, and now it is because, the Ukrainians are using Western weapons to attack us. So I think it's not clear how this will unfold. On Crimea in particular, while this has been such a big part of Putin's policy over the last 10 years, the annexation of that territory. The last time I was in Moscow was in 2019. I happened to be there at the 5th anniversary of the annexation. It was all over the TV news, all about this, how you could go on holidays to Crimea and everything like this. And Putin was there with some Western politicians who perhaps Lenin might have referred to as useful idiots, who were going to sort of go along and join this ceremony. That striking at that, I think, which is still, for particularly bold Russians, something of a holiday destination. I think, while it's not necessarily going to return the territory to Ukraine, it is going to be something that is a thorn in Putin's side and may, force him eventually to some sort of negotiation that's not entirely on Russian terms if it continues. So I think these strikes are hugely significant in the longer term of evolution of the conflict.
Nevertheless, Olga, as Ukraine gets more and more access to weapons like the ATACMS, does Ukraine have to be extra careful about civilian casualties? Obviously, Russia is more or less completely unbothered about causing civilian casualties in its attacks on Ukraine, but the moral high ground has been incredibly important to Ukraine since February 2022 especially.
Well, absolutely. And, we have seen no proof that Ukrainians have ever targeted Russian civilians deliberately. And even with this missile, we don't yet know, as you mentioned, whose missile it was, because Russians failed to produce any evidence, which they usually do very quickly. So if they found any remains of ATACMS there, the photos, the videos would have been already all over the place. We are not seeing that 24 hours after the incident. Putin is also silent on that. Some people in the Kremlin, of course, have blamed Ukraine and said Ukraine is, it was Ukrainian missile and it was a deliberate attack on Russian children and so on. But we haven't seen any evidence of that. And just to add to the point that James made about the importance of Crimea, it is important for Russia because Crimea, literally after the annexation, has been transformed into a military base. So Russians are using Crimea as a platform to launch attacks all over Ukraine. It's a major naval base. It's a major base for electronic warfare and also, for all the missiles, launch pad and so on. So that's why these strikes that Ukrainians are increasingly able to perform are so important because Ukrainians are decimating Russian military capabilities in Crimea and basically making it unsustainable for Russians to continue stationing a large military contingent and a lot of weapons there.
Just finally, before we move off this subject onto a related one, James, there have also been these reports about at least 20 people killed in shootings in churches and synagogues in Dagestan. Russia is trying to pin that on Ukraine, much as it did with the Crocus City Hall attack. I don't think anybody's buying that, not least because while Russia was trying to pin Crocus City Hall on Ukraine, Islamic State was actually issuing a statement going, no, that was us. It seems likelier than not that this is more of the same. I guess to ask the question is to answer it, but has Putin sort of forgotten over the last 2.5 years what Russia's actual security problems are?
I think he's hoping that things like this are going to go away, and clearly they're not. This is obviously this is a region that's the history of conflict. Well, it depends how far you want to go back, right, to Russian conquest in the 19th century or to the more recent wars.
We don't have quite that long.
Well, okay, but or the more recent wars that have unfolded since the mid-1990s and the Chechen wars there, because obviously while there has been those large-scale conflicts are over. The smaller ones are absolutely not over by any means. And also, there was research that's looked into this showed that there were quite a lot of fighters from Dagestan, the region where these attacks took place, and Chechnya that went to fight in Syria against the Russian forces there, of course, and their Syrian allies. So it is an ongoing thing. It's interesting. I was just looking at a report from the TASS news agency on my way here in preparation for our discussion. It says that the fighters used foreign weapons, so they're still trying to sort of hint that there. Something which I find a little hard to believe given how easy Soviet weapons are to get one's hands on in the Caucasus. So, but it's implicit that it's something beyond there, that maybe it's Ukraine's fault or maybe it's the West. Nothing remotely plausible, but very important for domestic political consumption, because let's not forget, if we want to go back to the beginning of the Putin presidency, he built his rise to power on being tough on insurgents in the North Caucasus. Anytime something like this happens is a reminder that he has not provided complete security.
Well, let's move along just slightly, because tomorrow the European Union will take another step on the arduous plod towards admitting 2 new members. And in both cases, it might be even trickier than usual. The 2 prospects which will commence accession talks in Luxembourg are Ukraine and Moldova. Both are partially occupied by Russia. One is at war with Russia. And both seek membership of the EU, at least partially, as a guarantee against further predation by Russia, which means that Russia is likely to step up its key foreign policy strands of wrecking and obstructing in a bid to thwart both. Olga, first of all, nobody thinks that this is going to happen fast in either case. Indeed, it's entirely possible that at this stage these talks are rather more symbolic than they are substantive. But nevertheless, is this going to be felt in Ukraine as an important moment?
Yes, it will, but to a certain extent. Life in Ukraine is very difficult at the moment because there are constant blackouts every day. So people get several hours of electricity on all territory of Ukraine, not just close to the front line. Russian missile attacks continue. We are speaking about, casualties in Crimea, but just over this weekend, there were about a dozen people that Russians killed with their missile attacks in Kharkiv, in Odessa, in Pokrovsk today, including children as well. So, of course, politically, it's a very significant move because it cements Ukraine's place among the Western countries. Eventually Ukraine will be a part of the European Union. This is something that, several generations of Ukrainians were coming to protest for in the square, in Central Square in Kyiv. I myself participated in both Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity, and I know how important it was and it is for Ukrainians, to be accepted finally to this club of European nations, Western democracies. But at the moment, I think the more significant issue is security. And obviously, if, there was a decision at the NATO summit, upcoming NATO summit in July, to offer Ukraine membership, that would have made a much greater difference in Ukraine in terms of the public opinion. Although the support for the EU and NATO membership is almost the same. It's more than 80% at the moment. But the EU membership is seen more, as a political move, although there will be some bilateral security agreement signed with the EU tomorrow as well. So, simultaneously with the talks decision. But NATO membership is something that is seen as like the top priority in foreign policy and something that could guarantee Ukraine's security in the long term. The EU membership will not provide that, unfortunately.
Well, James, as listeners to Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk, and who isn't, will be aware because Moldova's National Security Advisor appears in the most recent episode. Moldova definitely sees this as a security buttress because Moldova cannot currently seek membership of NATO because it is constitutionally neutral, though, of course, constitutions can be altered. But one key difficulty, and there are many key difficulties, but one of the most obvious ones is the fact of the occupation of part of both of these countries. But is geographical integrity necessarily a prerequisite for acceptance into the EU? Because there is, of course, the example of Cyprus, which has been partitioned and occupied since, 1974?
Yeah. There is that precedent. And of course, with lots of things in the European Union, including budget deficits at the time, it's a matter of political will. These things can be overcome. And I think, as Olga was saying about Ukraine, it's tremendously important symbolically and as a sign of, the country's longer-term ambitions. But again, it's difficult to see how this can happen in practice because, this is one way and this is one of the causes of, Russia going to war with Georgia in 2008 and Russia going to war with Ukraine too, is to stop, if you can take part of a country's territory, it's quite an effective way of at least stalling, if not all longer term, preventing their membership of NATO. But I was also reminded with Olga talking about the Orange Revolution and the opinion polls, how rapidly those changed because, of course, at the time of the Orange Revolution, NATO membership was a project of the leadership of the revolution and was not, opinion polls then were 12-15% of people were in favour of joining NATO. So there's a lesson there for the Russian Foreign Policy Academy, about how to behave towards your neighbours if you don't want them to join alliances.
Yeah, well, Ukraine was a neutral country constitutionally before Russia's invasion in 2014. So actually, it only changed its constitution and the support for NATO grew after the invasion because that has been seen as the only kind of guarantee that Russia won't invade again.
Yeah, once again, Vladimir Putin earns NATO's Employee of the Month trophy. But Olga, the process of joining the EU for any aspirant country is incredibly complicated and incredibly technical, and there are lots of requirements and lots of contingencies. If we put to one side, and I realise this sounds kind of glib, but is not intended as such, but if we put the fact of Russia's attack and occupation of part of Ukraine to one side, what else does Ukraine still need to do? How far is it from meeting all the other requirements of an EU member?
Well, yeah, there are dozens of chapters of negotiations that need to be closed for Ukraine to become the member, and it will take years, although Ukraine has made a lot of progress because it had an association agreement with the EU in place for the last 10 years, so a lot of progress has been made. And de facto, since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine also enjoyed the 4 freedoms that the EU members enjoy. So basically Ukrainian citizens who are in the European Union, currently Ukrainians who got temporary protection in the EU, they have access to the labor market, they have access to education system, they can move freely between the EU countries, they can settle there, they can live there. So in a sense, Ukraine is already kind of practically halfway through, like half member in a way. It needs to be formalized. The chapters need to be closed, and of course there is a lot of work to be done on fight against corruption, which is being done. Which is even at wartime, Ukraine is fighting against corruption. But possibly there is at least optimism in Kyiv that it could take not such a long time as it did with, other countries that joined the EU before.
Well, just a final quick thought on that, James. How good a job do you think the EU is doing of addressing the understandable enough concerns of certain Balkan aspirant countries in particular who do think there is an element of queue jumping going on here?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's something that the European Union probably will have to address further down the line, but I think it's very, very important for Kyiv, which has suffered so much, and some would say that the West hasn't done nearly enough for Ukraine over the last couple of years, at least to give this very strong signal that, you who are under such threat, such damage and suffering so much are getting a very strong political signal from us at least.
Well, let's look now at the Middle East, and for the leader of a nation at war, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been extremely selectively communicative. It took from October 7th until this past weekend for him to give an interview to an Israeli TV channel, and when he did, he gave it to Channel 14, a conservative outlet which can traditionally be relied upon to give Netanyahu a relatively easy ride. Netanyahu said that the most intense phase of the assault on Gaza was winding down, though to people actually in Gaza this may seem an extremely relative distinction, but made remarks which appeared calculated to prepare for the opening of a new front against Hezbollah in Lebanon. James, this is another part of the world from which you have reported and know well. Is Netanyahu actually foreshadowing that we are going to settle accounts with Hezbollah, or is he doing that thing of saying, effectively, can somebody please come and talk me out of this?
I think it's probably more of the latter. I mean, to be honest, Andrew, ever since October, I haven't really been able to discern what Mr. Netanyahu's strategy actually is. He has got a short-term plan, which has not so far succeeded. I mean, of course, Hamas's armed wing's ability to strike at Israel has been severely depleted by the ongoing military operation. He has not got the sort of trophy captures of either of the two major leaders, either of the military wing or of the political wing. He has not succeeded in freeing all the hostages. He has not given a clear plan of what happens after, the mass death and destruction that's happened in a neighbouring territory. So I think, it may well be that. And this has become something that many observers have said since October, and I think it's probably still true. There is not an appetite in the region for a wider conflict. That doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen. People talk very frequently about the way that the First World War started at the moment. Nobody really wanted it, but it happened anyway. It is a risk in the region. But I think, too, that I don't think Israel, Iran or the United States or any of the other players in the region want to see a wider conflict. So that may be, as you say, an element of please somebody stop me doing this. That said, Israel does have a very serious security threat on its northern border, and we'll have to address it somehow.
Well, Israel does, Olga, have a serious security threat on its northern border. Since last October, Hezbollah has been shelling the bits of Israel it can comfortably reach fairly constantly. 60,000 people have had to be evacuated from their homes. But is there a case that Netanyahu is now Well, he now doesn't have much sympathy for trying to make this case because of the global outrage at what Israel has done in Gaza.
Yeah, well, he also faces a lot of pressure at home. He's not extremely popular, to say the least, right? Israel has seen massive protests in the last month. So to add that to, the foreign policy situation, to the conflict in Gaza, to the international pressure that he faces, I think he's under, a lot of pressure. And therefore, I'm even surprised by his confidence in saying, we are ready to open the second front, like we can manage it. I'm not sure.
He also did say, James, in this interview, during which he was asked one or two questions about his absence thus far, as you were alluding to, of any coherent policy or, vis-a-vis what's next. He did talk vaguely about a new administration for Gaza, but he did say that it won't involve Israel and nor will it involve the Palestinian Authority. So if we remove the idea of an Israeli occupation, which I don't think there's much appetite for at home or abroad. And if we remove any prospect of the Palestinian Authority being involved, who does that actually leave?
I don't think it leaves anybody, and that's why, come back to the point, I don't think there is a plan. The plan was probably for this to be over very, very quickly, with perhaps not realising the preparations which Hamas had obviously laid, expecting the response to what they planned on October the 7th and the difficulty that Israel has had in securing victory there. Of course, they're going to be able to, they vastly outgun their enemy there, but they don't know the territory well, and they have not, and their tunnels, and which Hamas had obviously prepared at length beforehand, are extremely difficult to for them to fight in and to overcome. But I don't know. I don't think anybody's got a plan. That's what I think was the most worrying thing about this. The United States, which for the last 50 plus years has been the main outside power in the region, has got ideas for a ceasefire that both sides continue to consider and then find objections to and reject. I don't think anybody's got a plan for this. And I don't know how you possibly go about making a territory like that inhabitable again. I mean, I was in Grozny, the Chechen capital, when the sort of 2 kilometres around the city centre were flattened then. But you've got some room to work there. I don't know how in practice you actually make Gaza City inhabitable again.
Well, let's move along to something altogether more frivolous, and this is South Korea, where many loyal listeners to Monocle Radio's fine programmes may not be able to download any of our shows due to the marauding of crows. Crows are wreaking havoc, it says here, upon South Korean electricity infrastructure, causing more than 100 power outages across the country in the last 3 years. It had been hoped that reclassifying the birds as vermin would encourage citizens to apply for the permission necessary to capture them, but there has been little take-up due to a disparity between hassle, considerable, and reward, little to none. Before we get into the solutions possible here, Olga, let's talk a bit about the problem. Have you, for an Australian, I think power outages and similar mishap caused by wildlife are not uncommon. Is it a thing? I know that the power outages in Ukraine recently are caused by much less cute and cuddly means, but has it ever happened in Ukraine? I don't know what you have in Ukraine that would disrupt your electricity.
No, I don't think any wild creatures would do that. When I was a child, we had blackouts, but that was rather due to precarious economic situation in the 1990s during, the transition from communism. Well, we might have just some adverse weather, but not animals, I don't think so.
Yeah, I do have friends in Australia, James, who I think have had possums chew through certain key cables in their cars. That can happen. Possums on electrical wires are a common thing as well, because they use them to basically get around, and quite often either snap them or decide to eat them, which seems to be like a fairly self-defeating thing for the possum on the wire to do. But have you ever suffered something similar?
I have, when camping in Australia, actually, and hiking.
I know. Why would people do that?
Quite a remote part of Tasmania. I was woken in the night by a wallaby trying to steal my porridge, which was in my tent. So you can imagine, for someone who grew up in Manchester, that was quite an exotic experience. I've done a lot of hiking in this country, in Scotland, but never in Australia, and that's was a very memorable thing. But it didn't, I didn't, obviously, because I was on a very remote campsite, power wasn't really an issue. I just, probably had a torch. And
you did get off quite lightly, and
this
is a power outage of a sort. And I swear blind this is true, or at least the friend of mine who told me the story swore blind that it was true. That they'd driven out miles into the bush somewhere near Canberra and sort of set everything up for sort of a lavish barbecue, an absolute outdoor feast they were going to have. And to be clear, it was low fire danger season. It was in an area where this is all entirely permitted. This is fine. There are facilities for the purpose. Everything was laid out. They were aware that there were a couple of, emus wandering around in the distance, the famously querulous large flightless bird. Anyway, while his back was turned, this emu came up to the picnic area, surveyed all the food laid out, everything it could possibly pick up and make off with, and it ate the box of matches. That is the emu for you right there. But to look at the solutions here, Olga, if the money was right, and so far it isn't, would you be into becoming a crow hunting vigilante? I don't know what the practicalities of that are.
No, I don't think so. I found it fascinating. We think that we are in control, especially, in big cities, right? We think they are run by humans. But then I think cases like this, they just show us that we are not, actually, that the wildlife is there, that the animals and the birds are there, and they can disrupt our lives. We are concerned about, the AI and technology, but then crows come.
Imagine if that capybara in Hanwell ever got loose, the havoc it would cause. As a general philosophical point then, James, to sort of round it out, should we just adjust to the wildlife in our cities? Because they do also have a problem, apparently, with the crows actually attacking people. The South Korean crow appears to have taken something of a leaf out of the book of the Australian magpie, and in certain places has taken to dive bombing people. In Australia, you do just have to live with it because the magpie is protected. I believe if it's especially pestilential, councils will send specialists to encourage it to nest elsewhere. But is it something we just have to cope with?
Well, this is really hard. I mean, reading this story before, the South Korean official who's quoted outlining the scale and nature of the problem says that catching crows with traps is tough due to their intelligence.
And so, the fact that they have wings and fly around.
Well, that's right. That's it. And then, talking about, animals and causing trouble, you might have seen the story in the Times newspaper here in the UK today about a part of Cornwall in the southwest of England where postal workers are no longer able safely to deliver the mail because they get attacked by seagulls. So, this is
the rebellion of birds.
It is a rebellion of birds. It's an international problem. Maybe it's time for an international conference to try to address the issue and see what expertise can be shared.
Maybe the UN could come with a solution, at least to that problem.
Yeah.
Well, it would be something. Olga Tokaryuk and James Rogers, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, the global gaming industry is expected to be worth over $500 billion by 2025, a figure boosted by cutting-edge virtual reality experiences and addictive mobile phone games. So how does the humble pinball machine in an arcade hall you can't even reach from the sofa still appeal to younger gamers? Well, Gerard van der Sanden played his first pinball at 6 years old and saved up his pocket money to own his own machine, aged just 14. And now at 50, he's found a home for an expansive pinball collection, turning an old grain store in Rotterdam's historic Delfshaven into a playable museum. Even Generation Z gamers are lining up to play, and as Andy Jones reports, Gerard is happy to teach them the history behind each machine.
If you love pinball, the Dutch Pinball Museum in Rotterdam is flipping brilliant. The noise you can hear behind me is one of 200 pinball machines, all being played by pinball addicts. We've got Pirates of the Caribbean, we've got Cactus Canyon, we have got the Jaws classic from the 90s. We've also got Excalibur machines, Gottlieb machines, King Kong machines, and pretty much every film franchise and gaming franchise you can think of, from Tomb Raider all the way to the Addams Family.
Hello, I am Gerard van der Sanden, and I'm the owner of the Dutch Pinball Museum. Pinball is the most beautiful thing to put in the museum, because people say it's a game. No, it is a game, but it doesn't stop there. It's artwork. Look at the Humpty Dumpty.
Look at the Humpty Dumpty.
Yeah. This is 1947. This is a back glass, and it's been hand-drawn by an artist. This is pure art form.
This is very beautiful. So this is the Humpty Dumpty 1947 by Gottlieb. This is the first pinball machine with flippers, and this machine changed pinball forever.
That's correct, because a pinball before 1947 it was nothing more than a pin and a ball and put a ball into play. And in 1947 they added flippers to it.
Yeah.
And you can...
That familiar sound.
Yeah, the familiar sound. And now you get control of the ball. Like, for instance, pinball now is like 90% skills.
There are so many other things out there for young people now, kids. They can play PS4, they can play virtual reality. Do you think pinball can conquer those games still?
That's why I started the museum, because I want to let people renew their childhood or let people introduce to pinball. But what most people don't know is that pinball is like the beginning of everything. Video gaming wasn't invented if pinball wasn't there. Like, for instance, Pac-Man was coming to the market in the beginning of the 80s. And programmers that work in the pinball manufacturing, they were transferred to the gaming industry because they needed people, programmers. But they struggled with some things, like, for instance, if you put a coin in the 80s in a Pac-Man game, how many lives do you get?
I don't know.
3. And they didn't know what to do with it. But hey, let's look at pinball. So Pac-Man has 3 lives because pinball had 3 balls. Without pinball, the video game took over completely, but pinball is the base. We cannot forget that. I'm a 90s kid, and that is where my heart is. But I also like fast games. Hard to explain, but I rather play on a pinball machine. Within 5 minutes, there's sweat on my forehead, and I'm finished, and I want to do it again. The one game with 3 balls that took me the most time of my life, that was The Lord of the Rings. It took me 1.5 hours for one game with 3 balls. I never played it since. Guys from 19 years old, they also have the passion. They're better players than me. For instance, there's a guy upstairs, it's Bart. It's 19 years, and he's now top 10 from the Netherlands for competitive pinball. He's a better player in 3 years. What I spent my whole life for, he's better now in 3 years. But he has information I didn't have. He's going to YouTube, he's looking at tutorials and everything. He's doing live streams for 1.5 hours, looking.
My name is Bart Razing. I'm 19 years old now, and I've been playing for 4 years almost. I like the mechanic feel. The point when I step into playing pinball, I stop playing games pretty much. I barely play games anymore. Whereas when you're playing, for example, let's say Call of Duty, right? You're just playing single games and you're not competing in a leaderboard, whereas there's hundreds of people playing on this machine and you're trying to get the highest score of all these people. I have a pinball machine at home from 1977. That thing is 3 years younger than my mom. That's a weird realization, but I also think that's really funny.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm not a big pinball player, right? But I played Banzai Run, and all I cared about for an hour was keeping that silver ball in motion. It didn't matter about my job, didn't matter about my emails, didn't matter about all the personal stuff that's going on.
And that's also, for me it's also a moment to step away from busy school life and everything around me. Just play a game, focus. The thing I like about working here is I can see these old people walk in here, around 60 years old, and you can see them glow up. Like they're becoming young again. You can see they see like a kiss, and they're like, oh, I played this when I was young, and then they're stuck, like glued to the pinball machine for 2 hours, and I think that's absolutely great.
Do you get annoyed if people beat your high score?
Not at all.
Not at all, never.
I love it because it's a new chance for me to become better.
And you've immediately got someone else to talk to. If you see them beat it, you've immediately got a best friend for life.
At a certain point, my scores are reaching scores that are crazy. Because, for example, we have a Batman pinball machine. Yeah, so the number 2 spot is around 500 million. And I'm in the number 1 spot with 40 billion.
I think we are in the Netherlands, the museum, with the highest returning customers. I want everybody that's inside to have his own pinball machine. And we can never grow like numbers for 100,000 because the maintenance is killing us. The mechanical parts always break, like the flippers or the bumpers or something, and it's old electronics.
So if you've got 100 machines that people are using, flipping, 10 of them will be broken by the end of the weekend?
By the end of the weekend. We got a group of 15 people working on them constantly. Sometimes people will come down and says, and with a little angry face, and they say, "Sir, can I ask you something?" "Yes." Why are the 10 machines broken?" "Didn't you see that there were like 100 machines turned on?"
Yeah.
What is your mindset? There's an American saying about pinball that says, "If it ain't broken, it ain't pinball." The most expensive machine that we have is 50,000 euros. It's a Magic Girl. They're only produced 19 times. Normally, a pinball machine has a theme like Indiana Jones or Terminator 2. They wanted to make a production out of it, but it went south, and the company started and went bankrupt. They only produced 19, and that is why it's rare.
We've got the pulled apart skeletons of hundreds of different old pinball machines, different backdrops, different bits of flippers. Even on the stairs are the lyrics to the Who's rock classic Pinball Wizard. From Soho down to Brighton, I must have played them all. So you're such a super fan that not only do you own over 200 pinball machines, you also own the machines that make the pinball machines themselves.
This is a mold from the Medieval Madness, and this is craftsmanship in its purest form. Uber rare.
If there was a fire and you had to run out of this building, you can only grab one thing. Yeah. You're not grabbing your oldest pinball machine. You're not grabbing the first ever one with flippers.
Not even the 50,000 machine.
You're not even the 50,000 euro machine. We're grabbing the bits of moulds that create the machines themselves.
And these are not 50,000, worth 50,000, but they can never reproduce it. If insurance pay, I'm going to find another one. I'm not going to find one of these.
That was Andy Jones reporting from Rotterdam, and that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Olga Tokaryuk and James Rogers. Today's show was produced by Henry Ree Sheridan and researched by Gunnar Grunlid. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.